Good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told, out of Voice of Radio. So today we need to talk about a new Pokemon EX, which could be a problem, because it's back. Incidentally, we're talking about Banette EX, if you hadn't guessed. And this is a kind of Pokemon where I saw the translation. Well, I didn't see the translation. I did the translation. I sat down, like a good boy, and really sat there and read. Because I'm trying to do all my translations myself with Scarlet and Violet. And now I can't do them quite fast enough, so I have had to look at some of Antoine's. But the X's, obviously, I'm like, right, I'm going to do this one myself. And I sit down and I have a look at Banette, and I translate the first attack, and I'm like, wait, that's a bit good. And then I translate the second attack, and I'm like, wait, that's a bit good. And then I go back and double check, and I'm like, oh, yeah, this is nuts. Absolutely nuts. Banette EX is ridiculous. Stage 1, Pokemon EX 250 seems slightly low, but we don't quite know yet, but it seems a tad low. But what we've got here is single energy, 30 damage. Your opponent can't play any item cards from their hand during their next turn. It's literally Seismitoad. For a single basic energy. With a much better second attack, which we'll get to in a minute. Yeah, this is absolutely ridiculous. It's a single energy. Now, do please bear in mind that this is a Pokemon EX. Ergo, you do have to be evolving it. That is very, very important. This is not a basic Pokemon. You do have to do the evolution thing. So you do give your opponent a chance to essentially get around this. Whereas obviously with your old Seismitoad, you could literally, your first attack could be Seismitoad item locking. Do please also bear in mind that we changed the rules with the advent of Scarlet and Violet, and that Pokemon tool cards are no longer subsets of items. So Pokemon tool cards can be played under item lock, which is actually a really big deal when we get to the second attack. We'll get to that in a moment. But item lock no longer includes tools. Your opponent can play tools. And the goal here is really very simple. You sit there and you item lock your opponent, and they can't get set up. Because sure, they can play supporters, but they can't play item cards. They're not going to be playing stuff like Ultra Ball to get their Pokemon. I'm not going to go through every item in the game, but things along those lines. And things go very, very bad, very, very quick. And that's a little bit of a problem. And then they lose the game. There are basically two issues with Banette. You're not doing very much damage, and you're an evolution Pokemon, which gives your opponent a chance to stop you before you get going. And would you believe it? We've literally got answers to both of them, because the second attack is Poltergeist. And if you've been following the game for a little while, you will know what I mean when I say Poltergeist. It's that attack. We've seen it a bunch before. Your opponent reveals their hand. This attack does 60 damage for each trainer card you find there. That is very important. The first attack locks item cards. The second attack does damage based on trainer cards. Incidentally, this is why the change to tools is such a huge change. And when that rule change happened, I told you there were going to be a bunch of situations in which that rule change became huge. This is one of them. Your opponent can attach all of their tools. Let's say your opponent has 2 tools in their hand. They can attach them under item lock, which they couldn't before, which takes away 120 damage. Yeah, that's a very big deal. And obviously, if you're playing against Banette, for the love of all that's good and holy, attach your tools. Don't give them that extra damage. But all the items that they can't play, all the supporter cards are limited to 1 per turn, etc, etc. You know, they're playing 4 Stadium, they play their first Stadium. Hey, that's 3 cards they can't play anymore that are going to let you do extra damage. And we've seen Poltergeist before. We have seen Poltergeist a bunch. We saw it on Gengar and Mimikyu GX. That saw a whole bunch of play. We've seen it in the past on Miss Magius. Back in the day, the one that came around originally in Undaunted. And, of course, long-time players will recognise the Gengar from Stormfront that had Poltergeist and was ridiculous. The difference with all of those cards is that they didn't have item lock. They're not the only ones, incidentally. It's the ones I can be bothered to mention now. They didn't have item lock. So you always had to combine them with another card that did. That's not the case here, ladies and gentlemen. Here you've got your own item lock. Now, essentially what happens is it's a little bit of a... Well, it's a timing exercise, like those golf video games, where you have to stop the bar at the exact right point. Because there comes a point where you stop item locking and you do a huge attack. And when you do that huge attack, assuming your opponent's got enough trainer cards in hand, which remember you won't always know, hey, brilliant, you do a big KO. But when you do that big KO, your opponent gets out of item lock. Now, only for one turn, but there then is a one-turn gap where your opponent is un-item locked. And that's kind of the give and take here. You've got item lock and poltergeist on the same Pokemon. And seriously, if you've been playing the game a while, you will know what a big deal that is. However, you've got to give up the item lock to use poltergeist. Simple as that. This is good. Incidentally, in terms of spying your opponent's hand, we don't have great options. We do actually have Ace Roller's Premonition, though, and I do really like Ace Roller's Premonition with this, because Ace Roller's Premonition, your opponent reveals their hand, you draw a card for each trainer card you find there. Firstly, if your opponent's got a handful of trainers, this is actually going to do really well in terms of just drawing you a bunch of cards, but also, if you play Ace Roller's Premonition, you will know for a fact how many cards your opponent have in their hand, which are trainers, so you will know how much damage you're doing, but you'll also know how likely they are to respond. Because remember, when you use Poltergeist, that then gives your opponent one turn to essentially go nuts and try and get round your item lock before you put it on again and repeat the cycle. This will give you that information. So yeah, this is a ridiculous card. But I told you had to evolve, and having to evolve is a little bit of a pain. But it's actually not a little bit of a pain, but because we can have a little bit of a look at what Shuppet does. And Shuppet comes along very, very, very nicely here. Shuppet's got an attack for a single energy that lets you flip a coin. And does 10 damage, I suppose. And if heads, your opponent can't play any item cards from their hand during their next turn. So here's the deal. If you go first, your opponent gets one turn before you can evolve where they can play everything. If you go second, your opponent gets one turn where they can play item cards but they can't play supporters or attack. And then a 50% chance of being item locked for the game. And then after that, obviously, you can start using Banette and jobs are good 'un. So actually, yeah, Shuppet is a really, really, really big help here that is going to get that item lock rolling a little bit earlier. And this is kind of huge. Like, there are going to be times where Banette can just fire off a big poltergeist and get a big hit, and that's going to be lovely. But the fact that the first attack, your item locking attack here, is a single energy is a huge deal. The fact that you can then add one for Poltergeist is a huge deal. And essentially the game is going to come down to those turns where you use Poltergeist. You get a big KO with Poltergeist, and then it comes down to your opponent as to whether they can get something else going on. And then, of course, you're going to be doing stuff like using Path to the Peak. So you've got item lock here and ability lock going on, because obviously you're going to be playing some other kind of disruption, and we've got the makings here of a potentially game-changing deck. And that is absolutely ridiculous, because obviously you're going to be using stuff like Crushing Hammer as we go, doing some kind of energy denial, trying to make sure, because that's the goal here, right? The goal is to try and make sure that your opponent can't get out of it. Your goal is to try and make sure that your opponent is going to have that one turn where you poltergeist, but they don't have any good viable attackers on board, so it doesn't matter that you give them that one turn, because sure, they can play their item cards, but they can't actually do anything else, so it doesn't really matter. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that's what I'm talking about. I mean, obviously, this is a 5 WotC card. Yeah, you all knew that at this point. It's an obvious slam dunk, home run, other sports analogy, 5 WotC card. Just crazy good, ladies and gentlemen. absolutely crazy good. That's what I think. I want to know what you think. So let me know in the comment section, would you? Go nuts! Be nice. And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at the Wasi. That's where we talk about Pokemon and card games and Pokemon card games, all kinds of fun things. And please do consider checking out patreon.com/PTCG Radio, where you can support the channel. You can get some bonus podcasts. You can join a Discord where we chat about anything you want. And you can have shout-outs on the channel like the lovely Noah Zoldak, who's been a supporter of ours for a couple of years at this point and is a very lovely person. So thank you very much for the support and for being a very lovely person. But by far the most important thing as always, look after yourselves till next time, would ya? Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross and you've been watching PTCG Radio.